mean, it sounds like a really simple question, but I actually think there is quite a lot more to it. Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, I am going to be trying to answer the question, at least for myself, to DNF or not to DNF, and not about a particular book. But I thought about this specifically because lately, I had a couple of books where I thought about DNFing and I didn't. And my opinions didn't really change going through, but it just kind of got me thinking about it because I've been someone that's kind of on both extremes to an extent. I used to never DNF books. And my big reason why, which I think is completely valid, is, well, what if, the book just starts off like slow or like you don't like it at first, but then you end up really liking it. And I've heard that from tons of people where they're like, oh my gosh, it took me a while to get into this, but it ended up being really good. Also, a lot of books that I love are very slow and take a while to get going. And so I've had plenty of books where like I wasn't super into it, but then I ended up really, really enjoying. And I used to think like, well, what if that ends up happening? And part of the reason I changed is I had a couple of books that I particularly didn't like. There is one book, it was when I used to pick up random mass market paperbacks. I'm like, oh, kind of a cool cover, sounded interesting. I picked it up and I hated the book. And it was like over 600 pages and I just like was pushing myself through and couldn't get through. And I did eventually just decide to put it down. But that was one of the few books I had ever DNF'd to that point. So I think there's definitely something to be said about if you're really, really having that negative of an experience, being able to put something down. But I've more so turned to where now I will DNF something pretty regularly because I read a ton. I go through a lot more and I have a lot that I want to get to, and I need to keep up with reading, for the channel, for doing reviews, which is primarily what I do. And so if I can tell like, hey, I'm not really liking this book, me putting that down and getting to something else is going to overall be beneficial for me. Another thing that's kind of put into perspective, a reason that it's sometimes better for me to DNF books is review copies. I have had quite a few review copies, and I used to try to never DNF those, but then it'd be the thing of I'm kind of forcing myself through a book, and especially if I'm not really liking it, or I realize, hey, this isn't really for me, I'm not the right audience, if I force myself through, and then you're getting a negative review, I feel like most authors would be like, oh, maybe just, a DNF, like, hey, this isn't for me, versus like, oh, I didn't like this book. And so it's one of those things as well, where, if I have like a lot of constructive thoughts to say, I still might do that with, a negative review for something like that. But, if I just start something, and I've had review copies like that where I'm getting into it and I'm like, hey, I can pretty quickly tell this is just not my thing. I don't think this is bad. I'll provide that feedback, but that's another part of it. And I do feel like I got to the point where I had so many things that I was forcing myself through that I was reading less, and I was just kind of constantly feeling into a reading slump. There were some books that I read as well that I just like, books that I really didn't like that I absolutely should have DNF'd, even some popular ones as well, especially some popular ones. And so it kind of was freeing for me to start DNFing books. And there are still definitely times where, I'll make kind of snap decisions and be like, I don't feel like this. Sometimes I'll just put a book down temporarily. But I do still think it is really valuable to read books and to find out, like, is there going to be something here? But I also think it's still really valuable to, DNF a book when you know it's not for you. So what's the right answer? Well, there isn't necessarily one, but I think it also depends on some other factors. And a big factor is, why are you reading the book? And this is something that I think differs as well, because if you're reading just for enjoyment, and you're just like, hey, I just want to read these books because I like reading, I think DNFing can be really important, because if you're having to force yourself through a book and you're only reading for enjoyment, why are you doing that to yourself? At that point, there's not much of a difference. Now, when you're somebody like me who specifically reads and has a YouTube channel where you talk about what you're reading and do book reviews, reading something, even if you're not liking it, can still be valuable if you have constructive feedback. And so if I'm reading a book because I want to review it, and I've had books like that where I'm like, this isn't really for me, I'm not really liking this, however, I have a lot of thoughts on it, I want to do a review, that's a book that even though I might not be liking it, I might still finish. So a recent example of that was Blood Over Brighthaven. I knew that wasn't for me pretty quickly on, but I had so many thoughts on it. I ended up doing actually kind of an in-depth deep dive talking about the book and my critiques of it. And I've done that for some other books too. There's I'm drawing a blank, but there was another book I read that actually, like, I seem to be like the only person who didn't like it, but I had a lot of critiques on it. And so I ended up still doing like, here's my constructive negative review. I don't really want to read a book just to do a rant review. It's something that I have done before. I've definitely had some rant reviews in the past. I think those can be fun sometimes. But again, I feel like if I'm reading a book because I want to review it, which is completely valid, something that I want to talk about, I feel like I should have some constructive reason or something I'm talking about other than just like, this book is bad. And I used to do something too. I used to, every book that I would read, I would do a review on. And I back then, I don't really do that anymore just because it's not always the most feasible. And like, if I'm doing a random book, like a book 2, or maybe I'll wait and do the whole thing. But I used to do that and just kind of talk randomly about the stuff. And I try to have I've tried to clean up my format a little bit and talk. But again, whether good or bad, I need something to say about a book. Because if I really don't have much to say, if I read something and I just don't have thoughts, I'll include it in a wrap up, but I'm not going to do a review. But so I definitely approach it differently. And now, granted, while I do read a lot of books to do a review, and that's something, I'm picking up books that I want to read typically, or challenging myself to read stuff like this year. I've challenged myself to read some more classics, things like that. So books that I'm either interested in, that I want to try, or that I'm going to enjoy. And sometimes I will read something like the recent example is I read, which I'll be talking about this later this week, but I read this random mass market paperback and it was not good. And like my reviews, it's not even mostly a constructive review. It's like, this is crazy. But for me, I got enjoyment out of reading something that was a bit absurd that I wouldn't have normally read and that was just kind of random. And so there are different reasons. And I've heard a lot of people with good reasons for both sides. And like specifically, so Andrew from Andrew's Wizardly Reads, who is the DNF king, he'll DNF anything. He'll DNF on the first page. He'd probably DNF on the first word if it hit him the wrong way. I'm exaggerating a little bit, of course. But I mean, Andrew's well known for DNFing, and he, to be fair, he typically knows himself well enough that he's just like, hey, this is gonna bother me, or I don't like this. We were reading the same book, and he DNF'd it very early. Immediately, and it's just that I don't like this. I feel like it's going to be this. And I'm like, I'm going to give it a shot. And I read the whole thing and I'm like, yeah, this wasn't very good. You were 100% right. And so it can work out that way. But then I specifically recently too, I saw Tom Orange talking about why he doesn't like the DNF books. And I think his reasons are completely valid there too, where it's, he doesn't want to DNF. He wants to experience the full book. Whether he ends up liking it or not, that experience is important. And again, I think both are completely valid. And it's where I don't even know particularly where I stand. I think it is still kind of situational for me, because if I just really don't like something or I don't feel like it's going to be for me, I've tried to be a lot better about putting it down, because there is so much that I want to get to, but also there were some things I've read lately, more so, like I mentioned a few of them, where I was reading for the standpoint of I wanted to critique this and I wanted to talk about it. And so I think sometimes it makes sense to do that for a discussion, as well as I've had things that I've DNF'd and people might be like, oh, actually, I think you would like this, or this gets better, and I'm willing to pick some things back up. So it is still kind of a mixed bag for me, but I think it's something that's really interesting to talk about, because it's not really as simple as just like, oh yeah, I DNF all the time, or I never DNF. I think there's situations, but there's also, I always think about too, there are certain books or series that I feel like I probably wouldn't have read or finished had I been somebody who DNF books. One of them happens to be Malazan Book of the Fallen, which took me like a year to read, and I was not reading other things. That's how slow I was going through those books. It was just Malazan for like a year, and it took me forever, and every single one of those books I would have DNF'd probably at least once. And I ended up really enjoying the back half of pretty much every book, and like I appreciate the heck out of the series after finishing it, but it was one that had I DNF'd at the time, I don't know that I ever would have made it through that series. Like if I was picking it up for the first time now and having the same experience, granted, I think I'd like it a lot more now, and I need to reread it for that reason. That's neither here nor there, it's different. But it's one of those things too. Are there other books or series like that? Because I've had things that I've started and, it took me a while to get into them, but then I ended up enjoying. And so some of it's just knowing yourself. And, once you start really, really reading a ton, which most of us that are on BookTube do out of necessity, and it's something that I've always been a reader, and I never like fully stopped. I really slowed down through certain parts of my life, but I always still was kind of still, getting through some stuff here or there. And so there's been that, but since BookTube, my book collection and the amount of books that I'm reading regularly have really, really gone up. And especially doing multiple formats now, there's a lot of things like that too. Sometimes if you're trying one format and it doesn't work, another one might, because maybe the audiobook sucks, but the actual book itself is good. Or maybe the audio is really, really good and the book's not that great, but you're interested only because of the audio. And I've had both those situations. So I think it's situational, but like I said, I'm really curious where you all land on this, based on on any of the stuff I've talked about, or just if you are a hard line DNF or don't DNF, or if you are kind of more in the middle, or if it just changes, because I've been thinking about it a lot recently just with some stuff I read, and so kind of wanted to chat about it. So those are my long-winded thoughts on DNFing or not DNFing. What are yours? Let me know in the comments. I'd be really, really love to hear and kind of just have that conversation here about DNFs. So definitely let me know. And then make sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Check the links in the description, as always, for the Patreon if you want to support what I do, as well as the Wizard of the Enclave Discord if you want to chat books, whether any of the books I mentioned here, which there were some, or really anything at all. It's a lot of fun, and we'd love to have you. And of course, if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.